Hi, good evening, and welcome to our business communication class. This is session number two, looking at the principles and process of communication. In the session one, we had looked at the same topic, but in that particular session, we focused so much on looking at the principles of communication. In this session, the session number two, we'll be looking at the process of communication, the process of communication, how the message is encoded by the sender of the message, decoded by the receiver of the message, and how the entire process goes. So let's look at the communication cycle. This diagram we're looking at right now is showing the communication cycle message coming from the sender. On the left side, you have the sender who has to encode the message. He has to encode the message, come up with a message to communicate. Remember what we said in the previous session that the sender is the one that feels the need to communicate and so encodes the message or ideas are put in form of the message, and he sends that message to the receiver. When the receiver receives the message, he or she has to go through the process of decoding the message. That's the process of trying to interpret, get the meaning of the message. And once message is properly received by the receiver has to indicate that the message has been clearly received, and of course that message is going to be either accepted or rejected. But when the message is accepted, the receiver is going to give some kind of response that shows that the message has been received and the response is given. If the message hasn't been received, meaning that if the message is rejected, then the receiver has to ignore the message. But in that cycle, you will notice that the receiver must give some kind of feedback to the sender of the message. So the cycle goes like the sender of the message transmits the message to the receiver or audience, and the sender transmits that message by using an appropriate medium. Remember, medium, we say this is the method that the sender uses to send the message, and of course, using an appropriate channel, which is the route that the message is going to take. But the sender transmits the message using a particular medium and an appropriate channel to the audience. The audience then decodes the message, this is the receiver, decodes the message and interprets the message, which is the process of decoding the message, interprets the message and gives response or a reaction to the message. This will show whether the message has been accepted or the message has been rejected. If the message is accepted, a reply is going to be given in form of feedback to the sender of the message. Now, there are three things that I want to clarify here that may need us to properly explain: response and reaction, reply, feedback. What are these things? So, starting with response and reaction, the response is simply the physical or vocal action confirming that the message has been heard and understood. The physical or vocal action that confirms that the message has been heard and understood. That's the response or reaction. And this response or reaction may be an issue of reflex. It may happen automatically. The receiver has to give some kind of response or reaction to the message, whether the message is going to be accepted or not. Reply. Reply, this is a planned answer you give to someone who speaks or writes to you. The reply is a planned answer that you give to the person who has spoken to you or the person who has written to you. That's what reply is. What is feedback? Feedback, this is the acknowledgement which reflects whether the purpose of the message has been accepted and is followed up by appropriate actions, or the message has been rejected, therefore ignored. That's what feedback is all about. It's the acknowledgement which reflects whether the purpose of the message has been accepted, therefore appropriate action taken upon the message, or whether the message has been rejected and therefore ignored. So those are the three things I just wanted to clarify in the explanation as we're talking about the communication cycle, how information flows from the sender of the information to the receiver of the information, and how that the receiver must give some kind of feedback. Now, in the diagram we're looking at, you will notice that there is one very important word that is there. This word is noise. Noise. Noise is simply talking about the barriers to communication, the barriers to effective communication that can happen. These barriers to communication can either happen on the sender side. So on the sender side, there's some kind of noise, there's some kind of barriers to effective communication, things that can hinder the send of the message to effectively communicate. There is also noise or barriers of communication that can happen on the side of the receiver. There are things that can distort the message, things that can hinder the receiver from understanding the message that is communicated to him. So let's try to look at the barriers to communication. Let's try to look at the barriers to effective communication. What are barriers to effective communication? A barrier of communication is defined as anything that disrupts smooth communication. Anything that disrupts smooth communication is called a barrier to communication or barrier to effective communication. Anything that disrupts smooth flow of information or smooth communication is called the barrier to communication. So, what barriers of communication do we have? The list of the barriers of communication are so many. We have a lot of barriers to communication. No one can manage to list all of them, but we just list a few of them. And obviously, we are just picking the common barriers to communication. So the list that we're looking at here as barriers to communication is just few items selected from a long list of the barriers to communication. So you may think of some more barriers to communication that are not part of the list. It's very much okay. Remember, our definition of the barrier to communication is just anything that distorts the smooth flow of information. Anything that disrupts smooth communication is called the barrier of communication. So these barriers of communication can either be physical barriers, organizational barriers, cultural barriers, and here in Zambia we've got a lot of cultural barriers to communication where people are failing to communicate effectively with other people of different cultures and different, this is because of the different beliefs of those cultures. Language barrier, another barrier to communication could be the language. You see, you communicate with someone who doesn't understand your language, so you got to make sure that as you are communicating, you're using the language that is familiar to your audience for effective communication. Maybe you're using a channel of communication that is not appropriate to the audience you're communicating to. That can also disturb smooth flow of communication. Interpersonal barriers, interpersonal issues can also disrupt smooth flow of communication. Individual barriers, these could be issues that has to do with you, the moods and everything like that. Those things can hinder smooth communication. The attitudes or attitudinal barriers, listening barriers, if you've got listening issues, that can also be a barrier to effective communication. Barriers while speaking, those can also be called barriers to communication. So the list is quite long. Language barriers, everything like that. A barrier such is just something that disrupts smooth communication. Now, I want us to also look at an analysis of these barriers to communication. Before we go to that analysis, you got to understand that the barrier in one situation may not necessarily be a barrier in another situation, because barriers are dependent on the situation that you're dealing with. For example, if you are speaking English and you're talking to people who can't understand English, then you have language barrier. That barrier may be a barrier in that situation, but when you come in another situation where you're talking to people who understand English, that's no longer a barrier. So a barrier to communication depends on the situation. So a barrier in one situation may not necessarily be a barrier in every other situations. So barriers are dependent. Now let's look at the analysis of these barriers to communication. Analysis of these barriers to communication and how you can handle these barriers. Now, looking at the analysis of these barriers to communication, I've decided to express this analysis in three different forms, because barriers may be something to do with people. These barriers may also be something to do with the environment, the physical environment within which communication is taking place. These barriers can also have something to do with the message. So, our analysis of barriers will look at people, environmental, and message barriers. So, let's begin by looking at barriers in connection with people. Now, summarizing the barriers in connection with people, we've used an acronym called MASK. Now, this is not the mask up because of the coronavirus issues. So, we're talking about masking up, uh, no mask, no entry. We find masking everywhere. But the mask I'm talking about is an acronym that represents certain things. But these barriers have to do with people. All right. So we need to understand that in many circumstances, communication breakdown is as a result of a human factor, as a result of the people that are involved. So now, people, we have to look at the aspects that causes breakdown in communication in relation to the human factor. Number one, M in the MASK acronym stands for moods. What are moods? Moods are temporal states of mind. They turn on and off. A good atmosphere can be instantly be spoiled because of people's moods. So moods are closely associated with self-concept. You've heard of people that are moody. Today they wake up, they are happy. Tomorrow they wake up with a different mood. And there is a saying that goes, today you wake up on the right side, tomorrow you wake up on the left side. And we refer to people who behave like that as mood people. Now, a mood is a temporal state of mind because it can change anytime. It's a short lived state of mind. It can change anytime. But you will believe that if people are in a certain mood, they communicate in a certain way. For example, if you are very happy, you are excited, communication can flow so well because you are ready to listen. Your mind is quite excited. Tomorrow you may have a very bad mood and you don't want to communicate, and that will distort the communication process. So, if communication is distorted because of people's moods, these moods can either affect the sender or the receiver of the information. That barrier is caused by a human factor, mood. All right. And then How do you high on that? You got to know how to speak to people and how to read the mood, because the mood can help you to understand the language you can use, the tone of the voices you can use to speak to a person who is in a certain mood. For example, if people are mourning, for example, they've got a funeral, they are in a certain mood, they are in the mourning mood. So you can't go to such people and try to communicate using jokes. It will not happen because the mood cannot allow for that kind of communication. So, number one, mood. Number two, it's the attitudes of people. So A in our mask acronym stands for attitudes. What are attitudes? Attitudes are sustained mood. That is mood which has been established uh, for a period of time. A mood that has been established for a period of time, or a mood which have an established pattern, thereby becoming more regular as a feature of one's states of mind. So an attitude develops from the mood. If that mood will be sustained over a long period of time and it becomes the common feature of one state of mind, it becomes an attitude. It becomes an attitude. So that attitude will also affect communication. You've heard of people say, no, he has a wrong attitude towards this. This one has got a bad attitude towards this. And those things develop from sustained mood in our minds, which becomes a regular feature of someone's state of mind. That's the mood. The S in our mask acronym, the H stands for skill. Skill relates to the ability to do something effectively or correctly. That's skill. Ability to do something well. That's skill. Now, communication barrier may develop from the fact that the communicators have no skill of communication, which we call the communication skills. They have no communication skills. If their communicator has got no communication skills, of course, there will be a lot of distortions in that communication, because there is no skill, there is no ability, there is no know how to communicate. There will be a lot of noise generated from the sender of the message because there is no skill to communicate. Some people develop communication skill to an extent that whenever they communicate, they break some attitudinal issues in the communication and they make the communication flow smoothly. And other people do not know, or they don't have the abilities to communicate well. Even when the mood is okay, they will distort the mood by bad communication. So you need to have some kind of skills for you to communicate very well. K of our mask acronym emanates from knowledge. K stands for knowledge. So what is knowledge? Is the know-how on the subject matter relating to the correctness and accuracy of the material in the message. If you are communicating about a given subject, you must make sure that you know the material very well. It helps you to communicate well. Knowing how to communicate and knowing the materials you are communicating are two different things. You may know how to communicate, but if you don't have the knowledge of what you're talking about, you may communicate wrong information. So, if we are to overcome the human factor as a barrier to communication, we must be dealing with these four things. Deal with the mood, be able to interpret, understand, and discern the moods, be able to deal with the attitudes of people, either on the side of the senders of the information or receivers of the information. Make sure you have some kind of skills in communication, which we call the communication skills. And the reason why we're talking about this, We are training as accountants, but as accountants, we'll be part of this big organization where we need to communicate with other people within the organization. So we must know the communication skills so that our communication can flow smoothly. Then, lastly, you must have the knowledge on the subject matter you're going to be communicating. All right, that's the people factor in our barrier analysis, communication barrier analysis. Let's move on to the next uh, item, which is the environment. The environment. Some barriers emanate from the fact that the environment within which the communication is taking place has got certain things that distorts the communication. These could be things like physical noise, and there we see a man who is in the midst of, it seems like a big noisy city. Trains are moving, trumpets are being blown everywhere, announcements are being, planes are flying over, vehicles are also making their own noise. There are speakers on the right bottom there, and they are also making noise. This is a situation like you go to Soweto Market or you go to City Market. You have a lot of noise. Here, somebody is playing music loudly. There, somebody is shouting. And there, somebody is also advertising in a loud way. Communication in an environment like that will be distorted because of the physical noise. So, you're looking at physical noise, technical noise, uh, disorder in an environment, things like lighting. We know that lighting can also affect communication. I don't know how many of you have been in a tavern or nightclub where that's why they choose different type of lightings, because they want to create a certain environment that is going to have an impact on the communication of the people who are in that environment. Distance, physical distance, that can also be a barrier to communication. So this is the environment. So how do you deal with the environmental factor in dealing with barriers to communication? You must make sure that communication is taking place in a conducive environment, away from noise. The order of the environment should be appropriate to support certain communication. That's why when you walk in certain offices, they arrange furniture in a certain way. They arrange stuff in a certain way. The air conditions are there for a particular purpose to try and help the communication flow smoothly. Let's move on to the last factor here. It's the message itself. The message itself. Now, there is what we call the 7 C's of communication. These are talking about the message, because if the message is inappropriate, your communication will be difficult. Now, to easy to deal with those barriers of communication that comes as a result of the message not being constructed well, the message not being clear, the message not being complete, the message not being considerate of the receivers, the message lacking things like courtesy. Because if you're communicating to me and you don't have respect of me, you are making it difficult for me to accept the message you are passing on to me, and that can be a barrier to communication. So the 7 C's are talking about how you can construct a message that overcomes the barriers to communication. So number one, your message must be clear. It must not be ambiguous or vague. The message must be clear so that the receiver of the message understands exactly what you're talking about. Number two, the message must be complete, meaning providing information to answer the who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. It must be complete. Every important element in the message must not be left out, as long as it can help in the smooth flow of communication. The message must be concise. Despite being so complete, the message should be as brief and to the point as possible. There is a limit to what people can hear and understand in a given space of time. So you have to make sure that even though your message is complete, you are including every necessary element. You must be as brief as possible, straight to the point. That will help in the smooth flow of information. Uh, then your information must be concrete. Concrete means being specific of quantities, times, and values. For example, instead of the meeting will be in the morning, you can say the meeting is at 10 hours. Because when you say the meeting is in the morning, people will still remain with questions. Morning has got so many hours, but what hour in the morning? So instead of saying the meeting will be in the morning, you can say the meeting will be at 10 hours. That's quite concrete. It's specific in terms of quantities of words using the times and the values. It must be specific. Number five, your message must have courtesy. Courtesy. The audience needs to be taken into consideration in terms of their capabilities, interest, dignity, and pride. You're talking to individuals that have got pride, individuals that have got a certain level of dignity, and in your communication, you must take all those things into consideration. For example, when you are talking to your lecturer, you can't be talking to your lecturer as if you are talking to a young brother or young sister. There should be some consideration. That's what we mean. Courtesy, respect. You must respect the feelings of the audience. You must know what they may appreciate and may not appreciate in your communication. Some people are so poor at communication that they will talk to anybody anyhow. Here you must have courtesy if you want the communication to flow smoothly. Then the last one, there should be correctness. Your message must be correct. The audience are always willing to believe what you are telling them. If people seek to listen to you, they are ready to believe what you are saying. So, meaning that you must make sure that you're giving them correct information. Correct information. Make matters serious. You are training as accountants. The reports you produce are going to be believed by all stakeholders of organizations. Why? Because they know you are a qualified accountant. Now, just imagine you produce information that all stakeholders are going to believe, and more importantly, they are going to make decisions based on the information you provide. And then you provide wrong information, incorrect information. It means you've misguided their decision making, and it may lead to losses. So make sure that the information you are communicating is correct. All right, now let's look at some steps to effective communication, overcoming the barriers of effective communication. We can summarize this in this form. Effective communication requires that the communicator is connecting with the audience. Use simple words when you're communicating to the audience. Your body language must be appropriate with the message. So things like, if the message is a good message, you may communicate it with a smile, but always maintain eye contact. Your gestures must agree with what you're talking about. The tone of your voice must agree with the message you're communicating. Let me give an example here. If you're giving me a message which is bad news, something bad has happened, of course you can't communicate to me about the bad news while smiling. Effective communicators, they know how to use their gestures when they are communicating, and gestures actually tally with the type of message they are communicating. Be cultural sensitive. You communicate with people of different cultures, more especially in organization, international organizations where you have different people from different backgrounds and different cultures. Be sensitive of the cultures. Then check for understanding. Is the message that you're communicating understood by the audience? And for you to ensure that there is understanding, sometimes you can ask questions. That's why sometimes we'll have some interactive sessions where I'll ask questions and you ask me questions. These are going to be live sessions. Then seeing the participation, is the audience participating in what they're saying? That can help them to understand the message you are communicating. Effective questioning, know the appropriate question to use as you are communicating, and also be able to summarize what has been said. All right, so those are some of the things you need to consider. So, number one in the steps to effective communication, you need to understand how beneficial effective communication is going to be. How beneficial effective communication is going to be. When you're looking at the list we have highlighted here, again, I've just highlighted few things, but the other things I'm going to explain, just explaining them. So be able to understand the benefits of effective communication. That effective communication is going to be beneficial to the individuals and to the organization. To the individuals, effective communication will improve your knowledge levels, it will improve performance. To the organization, effective communication is going to improve things like customer satisfaction, increased sales, higher turnover. Those are some of the benefits of effective communication. Number two step to effective communication is you must take a proactive approach to barriers uh, to communication. You must be thinking about the barriers of communication in advance so that when you come to communicate, you would have dealt with all the barriers to effective communication. You would have dealt with things that may hinder your communication. Another thing that you need to consider as a step to effective communication, step number three, is to use appropriate models of communication. There are two main important models of communication. That's the KISS model and the PASS model. Uh, KISS model is the KISS, which simply refers to keep it short and simple. When you are communicating, you don't have to include irrelevant things in your communication. Just keep it simple and keep it short. So KIS, keep it short and simple. Follow that model, you find it, your communication will be easy and your communication will flow smoothly. Then the other one, the other model is the PASS model, the PASS model. The PASS model talks about the purpose. You must be able to clarify the motive for your communication. What's the purpose of this communication? You must clarify what you are trying to achieve in that communication. That will help you to construct the message that is appropriate for that type of communication. You see, the purpose could be just to inform, to advise, to request, or to clarify certain things. That could be the purpose of communication. But please, when you are communicating, make sure that you understand the purpose and it's clear. Number two, the PASS, P purpose, A stands for audience. You must be defined who is the audience for your message. When you know the audience for your message, you are going to use the seven C's, or other books talk about the six C's appropriately, because the audience could be either internal, you're talking to people within the organization, or external, you're talking to people outside the organization. When you look at the organization has got a lot of stakeholders. Some of them are internal stakeholders, others are connected to stakeholders, others are external stakeholders. So, who are you talking to? Understand your audience. That will help you come up with an appropriate message. Also, in terms of understanding the audience, you must understand the age or the age group of the people you're talking to, the size, the gender, the professional levels, the social standing, um, the personal issues. of the audience. That must be clearly understood and it will help you construct the message. The S there is structure. A suitable form or design must be adopted for effective communication. So what structure are you going to use in your communication? Obviously, if you are communicating, we always say, if it's written, we will say, give an introduction, uh, go to the main body, draw the conclusions. You may follow that structure for effective communication. And the last one is style. What is your style of communication? The language employed in your communication will be part of the style of communication. The sender must find an appropriate language for your audience, and this may be summarized in another acronym called PADCAP. 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 So this PADCAP stands for precise, appropriate, dignifying, colorful, active, and popular. So you may follow that again in your communication style. But the PASS stands for purpose, audience, structure, and style. Finally, in this particular session, I want to conclude with the 10 commandments of communication. Before I go there, let me just talk about the 5 themes that we have on our screen there. Features of effective communication. You must be an active listener. You must maintain high contact. You must maintain an appropriate posture. You must use simple language and use appropriate questioning skills if you want to engage your audience in your communication. Finally, the 10 commandments of communication. Number 1, you must seek to clarify. Number 2, examine the true purpose of each communication. Number 3, consider the total physical environment and human safety for that communication. 4, be aware while communicating of the overtones. The tone is very important. Be able to moderate the tone so that it matches with what you're communicating. Take an opportunity when it rises to convey something that will help your audience in terms of value. That will bring something of value to your audience. So you make sure that every time you're communicating, there is some value that is passed on to your audience. The next one is follow up on your communication. Follow up to just make sure that the audience you're communicating to, they understood your message and it's clear to them. If you do not do that, your audience may misinterpret what you're talking about. So make follow up. Be sure that supportive actions are going to be taken, or be sure actions that you take supports the communication. Seek to not only be understood, but also to understand your audience. Many people that fail in communicating smoothly, they seek to be understood. They are quite selfish in their communication. They just want the audience to understand their point of view, but they don't want to understand the audience. So understand things also from the point of view of the audience. And finally, be a good listener. When you are good at listening, your communication will be effective. I want to thank you so much for your time. You took time to listen to this video. I'll see you again in the next video. Shalom.